She shouldn't have been that close. Not to something wild. Not to something no one could touch without gloves, poles, and tranquilizers just hours ago. Yet there she was, barefoot in the dirt, her tiny hand hovering inches from the face of a bobcat that everyone in the auction yard had just agreed was untamable. The crowd didn't breathe. From across the rails, men who'd wrestled bulls and branded calves stood frozen, their eyes fixed on the strange calm unfolding before them. Women who'd whispered warnings moments earlier now clutched their chests. The little girl, maybe 4 years old, smiled as if the animal wasn't dangerous, as if it wasn't predator, as if it hadn't been growling and lunging inside a metal crate just this morning. And the bobcat was still, not still like a hunter, still like it was waiting, listening, letting her be close. Nobody understood it, but nobody stopped it either. The moment had landed like a thunderclap in the quiet of a golden afternoon. 1 second, the crowd had been murmuring over the final sale of the day, a small bobcat with jagged ear, tired eyes, and a label slapped across her cage. Untrainable. High risk. Wild. The next, that same animal was standing on all fours, no muzzle, no handler, and the little girl was in front of it, reaching out. Not because someone told her to. Not because she wanted attention, but because something pulled her toward the creature. Something no one else could feel. It had started just minutes earlier. The auction was winding down beneath a soft western sun. Dust floated in the warm air as ranchers leaned on fences, sipping iced tea, trading stories about colts and feed prices. Behind them, a line of crates and pens held the usual last-call mix of goats, dogs, and small livestock, plus one anomaly. A bobcat, maybe a year old, for sundapple and uneven, stared out through bars with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite defiance. Just silence. She hadn't been listed on the main flyer. Some whispered she'd been confiscated from an illegal breeder. Others guessed she was rescued too late to be re-wielded, too wild to be homed. Whatever the truth, she sat like a question no one wanted to answer, until the tag was slapped on. And she was sold. That should have been the end of it. Papers were being signed. The crate was left open for inspection. And people had moved on until they noticed the bobcat hadn't moved. She stepped out on her own. Not fast. Not frantic. She simply walked forward, slow and deliberate, right past the open gate, and into the dusty ring where earlier cows had thundered and ponies had circled. No one dared approach. No one yelled. They just watched, waiting to see what she'd do. That's when the girl appeared. She hadn't been standing near the front before. No one saw her slip past the adults. She wasn't loud or excited like children usually were in places like this. She was quiet, watching. She stepped through the lower rail. And instead of calling her back, something stopped everyone from moving. Because the bobcat, this untamable, unpredictable animal, turned and looked at her. They stared at each other for a second that stretched like a hell breath. Then the girl walked closer. The rest of the story, the one they'd all remember, hadn't happened yet. But even now, in these first few steps, something had shifted. The world didn't feel like an auction yard anymore. It felt like something sacred had just begun. And every heart on the fence was holding on to one question. What was this child doing? And why wasn't the bobcat stopping her? The wind shifted softly through the auction yard, lifting flecks of hay into lazy spirals and stirring the quiet like a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, a gate creaked, but no one turned to look. Every eye remained locked on the girl and the bobcat. Two figures in stark contrast, yet somehow sharing the same stillness. The girl stood just a few feet from the animal now, not moving quickly, not trembling. Her hands hung loosely by her sides. The edges of her sleeves were smudged with dust. A faint smear of something green, grass or crayon, colored the back of her hand. She didn't seem to notice the silence around her, or the tension that stretched from one end of the fence to the other like a pulled wire. Her eyes were fixed only on the bobcat, wide and open, holding no fear. Just fascination, gentle, unfiltered wonder. The bobcat's body remained low to the ground, but not in a crouch of threat. Her muscles were still, not coiled. Her ears were turned forward, her breathing measured. She blinked slowly, and in those blinks was the absence of aggression. There was wariness, yes, but not the kind born from instinct. It was older than that, tired, like she had been waiting far too long for the moment to come when someone might see her without flinching. The little girl stepped forward again. Tiny grains of dirt shifted under her shoe. A single murmur stirred from the crowd, but it fell away just as quickly. No one wanted to break what was forming between them. Something delicate, something rare. The bobcat didn't move. She simply tilted her head, ever so slightly, the way animals do when they're trying to understand something unfamiliar, but not yet unwelcome. Her tail flicked once behind her, slow and controlled, and settled again against the ground. Her paws, dust-covered and silent, held her steady. It was a stance of choice, not captivity. Then the girl crouched, the way children do when they see a bird on a windowsill or a kitten under a porch. Soft, without urgency, hoping the stillness might invite trust. For a long moment, neither moved. Around them, the auction yard began to fade from view, not literally but emotionally. The corrugated tin roofs, the dust-covered boots, the creased brows of the ranchers leaning on rails, all of it dissolved into the quiet heartbeat of that central moment. A 4-year-old girl and a wild animal, born into a world that taught it only defense, now shared breath and earth and silence. Then it happened. The girl reached out, not with both hands, not suddenly, but with a single, slow motion of her right palm. She held it out, open and low to the ground, the way one might reach toward a timid dog or stray cat unsure human touch. Her fingers didn't twitch. Her arm didn't tremble. It was a gesture of complete stillness, offered with nothing but trust. The bobcat leaned forward, only slightly, a few inches. Her nose twitched. Her eyes narrowed. The sharp edges of her face, so often described in auction paperwork as feral, hostile, difficult, now looked softened by the slant of golden light brushing her fur. Her whiskers brushed the girl's hand. A sound moved through the crowd. A gasp, or maybe a collective exhale. It didn't break the spell. It only echoed what everyone felt, disbelief wrapped in awe. Then the bobcat did something no one expected. She didn't swat. She didn't turn away. She didn't retreat. She sat, her hindquarters folded down slowly, her shoulders still lifted in caution, but her claws remained sheathed and her eyes stayed locked on the child. She didn't blink this time. She just watched, steady and unafraid. The gesture, simple as it was, landed like thunder in the crowd. A wild creature, marketed that morning as untrainable, unsuitable, and unsalvageable, had not only tolerated a child's touch, but settled into its presence like it found something it recognized. The girl smiled, not a wide, triumphant grin. It was smaller than that, a smile that barely curled her lips, but filled her entire face. A smile born from something she didn't need words for, a knowing. She reached again, slower this time, and brushed the fur along the bobcat's neck. And the animal leaned, not pushed, not lunged, but leaned into the pressure. There was no growl, no twitch of the tail, just a long, low breath that made the dust along her shoulders rise and fall. Her eyes half closed, not in threat, but in peace. The crowd, for the first time in what felt like hours, began to shift again, slowly, cautiously, like waking from a dream. One man removed his hat, pressed it against his chest, and whispered something to the person beside him. A woman blinked away tears and reached for her daughter's hand. No one laughed. No one scoffed, because what they had seen didn't make sense. And yet, somehow it did. The auctioneer, who had been silently watching from the barn door, stepped forward a few paces but didn't say a word. The clipboard in his hand sagged slightly at his side. He'd sold a dozen animals today, some strong, some sick, some friendly, but none had done what this one just had. No one moved to claim her. Not yet. The paperwork could wait. At the center of it all, framed by a dusty sunbeam and a quiet hum of awe, the bobcat and the girl stayed as they were, unmoving, bonded by something no one else could see but everyone felt. And somewhere deep inside that animal, beneath the months of cages, the bites and fear, the nights of pacing behind chain link, a new thread had formed, not from training, not from food, but from something far rarer, recognition. of safety, of softness, of home. It didn't make sense. But it didn't have to. Not to the girl, not to the bobcat, and certainly not to the world watching in silence, waiting to understand how something untamable had just chosen, on its own, to stay. The dust had settled, but no one dared stir it. A heatless quiet stretched across the auction yard, not from the sun, but from the stillness in the center of it all, where a wild bobcat, once labeled unfit for taming, now sat just inches from a 4-year-old girl, as if she'd known her all her life. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a fluke. This wasn't a moment of luck that might turn at any second. It was something deeper, something deliberate, something real. The girl didn't speak. She hadn't said a word since she walked into the ring. Her hands, now resting lightly in her lap, didn't reach anymore. She didn't need to. The bobcat had already come to her, and now it was closer, not out of curiosity, not out of hunger, but out of something that only the animal understood, some pull inside her that told her this tiny human was safe. The girl tilted her head slightly, watching the way the sunlight played along the edges of the bobcat's fur. It shimmered in places, faded in others, like it had once been beautiful but had worn thin with time. There were scratches on her shoulder, faint and healed, hints of a life spent in cages or corners she didn't belong in. Yet here she was, calm, breathing slowly, holding still not because she had to, but because she wanted to. And then, for the first time, she moved again. She lifted a paw, not high, not fast, just enough to brush the girl's leg. Someone gasped softly. A man near the gate took a half-step forward, ready to intervene, but the paw didn't strike. It rested. The pads of it touched the fabric of the girl's jeans, then retracted, and the paw lowered again to the earth. A simple gesture, a test, and a choice. The girl didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled and leaned a little closer, her nose nearly brushing the top of the bobcat's head. A breeze caught her hair, blowing a few loose strands across her cheeks. She didn't brush them away. Her eyes stayed locked on the creature beside her, wide and completely unafraid. Then something happened that no one, not the crowd, not even the girl's mother, could have predicted. The bobcat licked her. A single swipe of the tongue, rough like sandpaper, across the girl's forearm. The crowd gasped, but this time it wasn't out of fear. It was something else. Disbelief, emotion, because licking to a bobcat isn't a show of dominance. It's grooming. It's belonging. It's love. The girl giggled. Softly, just a flutter sound that made a few people smile in spite of themselves. And in that instant, the bobcat visibly relaxed. Her shoulders dipped, her weight shifted to one side, and for the first time since she stepped out of that cage, her entire body language spoke of comfort. She was home, not in a building, not on a property, in that child's presence. The girl reached forward, fingers open, and this time placed her hand gently between the bobcat's ears. The animal closed her eyes, and for a long moment, they stayed just like that, together, unmoving, breathing the same soft afternoon air as if nothing else in the world existed. People along the fence began to lower their cameras, not because they'd captured what they came for, but because they knew they couldn't. This wasn't a viral moment to be packaged and shared. It was something sacred, unspoken, a scene that would live longer in memory than it ever would on a screen. The auctioneer, stoic and grizzled from years of sales, trades, and empty goodbyes, wiped a hand down his beard and shook his head, muttering under his breath, "Never seen anything like it. Never." And slowly, others nodded, not in disbelief now, but in quiet reverence, because they were no longer watching a wild animal tamed down. They were watching a wild animal choose someone. The bobcat curled her tail around her paws and tilted her head into the child's hand. Her eyes half closed, not out of fatigue, but peace. She wasn't fighting anymore. She wasn't calculating her next move. She was simply safe, and everyone could feel it. One woman in the crowd pressed a hand to her chest and whispered, "She's never done that for anyone, not even the rescue team." The girl's mother, still by the gate, didn't interrupt. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't move. She knew. Somehow she knew. This wasn't just a moment. It was a beginning of something. of healing, of choosing, of belonging. The girl stood now, slowly and carefully, brushing dirt from her knees. The bobcat watched her, calm and curious. And then, incredibly, she stood too. Side by side, the girl and the animal turned slowly to the crowd, and the bobcat took a step forward with her. One step, then another. The girl didn't look back, and neither did the bobcat. Together, they walked to the edge of the ring, and the people parted not in panic, but in reverence. No one stopped them. No one dared, because they understood now. Something untamable hadn't just chosen stillness. She had chosen someone. And in doing so, she had rewritten everything they believed about fear, instinct, and the invisible thread that ties two souls together, even when one walks on pause, and the other wears shoes 2 sizes too big. The spell began to break, not all at once, but with a slow ripple of reality returning. A distant truck engine sputtered to life. A few murmured voices started to rise again. Dust swirled in little gusts beneath the crowd's boots. And somewhere near the barn door, a man's silhouette appeared, holding a clipboard and wearing the kind of expression that doesn't ask questions. It expects answers. He was a buyer, and he was back. In his other hand, loosely clutched, was a slip of paper, the bill of sale, final, signed. His boots scraped the dirt as he approached the fence, and as he got closer, confusion crept across his face. The bobcat was no longer in the pen, no longer crouched behind steel bars or pacing like she had that morning. Instead, she stood just inside the ring's edge, uncaged, untied, beside a little girl in a red plaid shirt who looked like she belonged there more than anyone else. "What the hell?" the man muttered. A few heads turned, eyes narrowing, unsure whether to intervene or remain still. They didn't know how to explain what he was seeing. How do you tell a man that the creature he bought no longer seemed like his? He climbed up the first rung of the fence. "Hey," he said louder now. "That's mine." The girl didn't flinch. The bobcat did. Her ears twitched. Her head turned, not in alarm, but in awareness. Her body stiffened slightly. She sensed something changing, something ending. The girl looked up at her, and something passed between them. Something quiet and invisible but unmistakable. The kind of understanding animals have with those they trust. She reached out gently and touched the bobcat's shoulder. It was a small touch, but it was grounding. The bobcat settled slightly, her weight shifting back onto her haunches. Still watching, still listening. The buyer was at the gate now, talking to the auctioneer, voice hushed but firm. There were gestures, points, a quick flash of the sale slip. Then the auctioneer shook his head slowly and motioned toward the girl. The man turned, stepping into the ring. People tensed, not visibly, not aggressively, but enough to feel in the air, enough to send a warning to the bobcat, who now rose back onto her feet. The man took a step closer. The bobcat moved in front of the girl. Just one step, one deliberate move, placing herself between the child and the man she didn't know. It wasn't a threat. It was protection. The man stopped short. "What is this?" he asked. "Some kind of show?" No one answered, because this wasn't a show. It was real, and it was happening right in front of them. "She came with me," the girl said softly, her first word since the moment began. The crowd was stunned into silence again. The words weren't loud. They weren't forced. They were just true. The man looked down at the bobcat, then back at the girl. "Kid, this isn't a petting zoo," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "That animal's wild. I paid for her. She's mine now." The words hung in the air, ugly and unnatural. Mine. As if that explained everything. As if ownership erased connection. The bobcat's ears laid back just slightly. Not enough to seem hostile, but enough to say she understood the tone. She understood the intent. She didn't move. She didn't run. But she didn't yield either. The girl took a step forward until she was beside the bobcat again. She looked up at the man. "She's not wild," she said. "She's just been scared too long." It was the kind of statement only a child could say without sounding naive. And it hit harder because it was simple, because it was real. The auctioneer stepped forward then, gently placing a hand on the buyer's arm. "Sir," he said, "I think you need to see what everyone else just saw." The man shook his head, frustrated. "It doesn't matter what I saw. I bought her. I have paperwork." "She chose her," someone in the crowd said quietly. No one turned to see who, but the words landed like a stone in a still pond. She chose her. Not the man, not the price, not the papers. The bobcat had chosen the girl. The buyer rubbed the back of his neck. His face hardened. "That animal's got value. I could have her trained. Breeders will pay." The words soured the air. Breeders, trainers, the very world the bobcat had just started to leave behind. The girl didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply turned toward the bobcat again, kneeling beside her, resting her forehead gently against the animal's shoulder. And the bobcat didn't move away. She leaned into it. The crowd said nothing. There was no need, because what they were seeing couldn't be undone by contracts or coin. It was something wild turning soft, something broken leaning into wholeness. The man stood there, unsure now. His confidence faltered. His voice quieted. He looked around, hoping for support, for logic, but all he found were eyes that had already shifted, eyes that had seen more than they expected today, and wouldn't unsee it just because it didn't make sense on paper. No one stepped in to help him, because deep down they all knew ownership didn't mean understanding, and what they had witnessed here today wasn't his to claim. Not anymore. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, sending loose flecks of hay dancing across the ring. The moment was heavy now, tension clinging to every breath. The man with the paperwork stood just inside the fence, papers clenched in his hand, his jaw tight. The girl knelt beside the bobcat, her cheek resting softly against the animal's neck. The bobcat, still and steady, stood like a sentry guarding something sacred. No one spoke. Not the mother, not the auctioneer, not the crowd. They waited, unsure what would happen next. But they all felt it, that something had shifted beneath the surface, like the pressure before a storm. Then, from somewhere beyond the fencing, a loud clang broke the silence. A gate swung wide, and behind it, movement. Two young calves, startled by a loose latch or a careless handler, bolted into the open yard, hooves clattering against the dirt, eyes wild with confusion. One veered straight toward the edge of the auction ring. The crowd startled, stepping back. A man shouted. Another stumbled trying to grab the gate. But the second calf, panicked and disoriented, ran headlong toward the open side of the ring, toward the girl, and the bobcat moved. In a flash, she was no longer still. She surged forward, not toward the calf, not to attack, but to intercept. A blur of fur and muscle crossed the space between girl and danger in a heartbeat. The bobcat leapt, not with claws raised or fangs bared, but with every ounce of instinct focused on one thing: protection. She planted herself directly between the oncoming animal and the child. The calf, confused by the sudden obstacle, skidded in the dirt, stumbled, and turned, darting off in another direction. The danger passed in seconds. The chaos settled almost as quickly as it erupted, but the moment remained. The bobcat didn't chase. She didn't run. She turned, slow and deliberate, back to the girl, and lowered her body again, pressing her side into the child's shoulder. The girl lifted her hand and gently stroked her back, and the crowd erupted, not in noise but in emotion. A collective wave swept through them. Tears in the eyes of strong men, hands covering mouths, heads shaking slowly in disbelief. What they had just witnessed wasn't instinct. It was loyalty, deliberate, chosen. The buyer, still holding his papers, lowered them slowly, like they had begun to weigh too much. His gaze flicked between the girl and the animal, then to the crowd, then back again. He had seen it too. The truth no one could deny now. The animal he had purchased, the one tagged Untamable, had just chosen a life that no money could buy. Not obedience, not submission, protection, and love. The auctioneer stepped forward, his voice quiet but firm. She saved that child. You saw it. The man didn't respond right away. He looked down at the papers in his hand, brow furrowed, lost in the math of logic and legality. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he let the papers fall from his hand to the ground. The wind caught them, tugged the corner, and carried them toward the fence. The man turned and walked away. No words, no demands, no arguments, just silence. He left behind more than the paperwork. He left behind his claim. There was a pause, then a soft noise in the crowd. Clapping, but not the kind meant for celebration. The kind meant for surrender, for humility, for something greater than applause. It built slowly, unsure at first, then stronger. Even the auctioneer clapped, even the mother. And through it all, the bobcat remained by the girl's side, tail flicking softly, ears forward, alert but calm. She didn't react to the sound. She didn't retreat. She stayed. The girl stood now, hand resting gently between the animal's shoulder blades. The weight of the world didn't rest on her. Only something smaller, quieter, but just as profound. Understanding. The kind of understanding only a child could hold without needing to explain. She turned toward the auctioneer and, with a voice as clear as the wind moving to the fence post, said, "She doesn't belong in a cage." No one corrected her, because she was right. The bobcat had chosen her, had protected her, had stayed when she could have fled. She didn't belong in a cage. She belonged with someone who saw her for what she really was. Not a danger, not a prize. A soul, untamed, yes, but not unreachable. And in that moment, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the auction yard, everyone there understood. This wasn't just a girl with a wild animal. This was something rare, something pure, something no one would ever forget. Not because it made sense, but because it made everything else seem small. The sun was beginning to lower behind the tree line, casting long, amber rays across the yard as the dust settled once again. The air felt different now, thicker with silence, but softer, too, as if even the wind knew that something important had happened here and was reluctant to move on. The auction crowd began to drift back, slowly and quietly, like people leaving a chapel after a sacred moment. No one shouted. No one laughed. They walked differently now, heads turned inward, steps slower, as if they had been reminded of something too easy to forget in the noise of everyday life. In the center of the ring, the girl sat once more, cross-legged in the hay, her tiny fingers trailing absent-mindedly through the coarse fur of the bobcat, who lay curled beside her. The wild animal that had once refused every hand now lay pressed against her like they'd been raised together. The girl wasn't doing anything in particular. She wasn't trying to train or tame. She was just being. And that was enough. The bobcat rested her head on the girl's lap and closed her eyes. The auctioneer stood off to the side, arms crossed, chewing the inside of his cheek as he looked on. The buyer had left. The paperwork was gone. There were no more bids, no more questions. Only one small life leaning into another, the dust of the day slowly giving way to quiet. The girl's mother finally stepped forward, kneeling by the fence, not call her daughter away, but to be closer to whatever this was. She didn't speak. She didn't try to reason with what she had seen. She just placed a hand on the fence post and watched. A gentle rustle came from behind them, the soft footfalls of the auction volunteers bringing an old crate, uncertain what should happen next. But they didn't move closer. They paused when they saw the bobcat's eyes open just slightly, her ears twitching toward the sound. The girl looked back over her shoulder and shook her head once. "She's not going back in there," she said, simple and quiet. The auctioneer stepped closer. "What do you think she needs?" The girl looked up at him, her eyes calm, wiser than any 4-year-old's ought to be. "Not be alone," she said. And that was the answer. No arguments. No forms. Just truth. Later that evening, after most of the trucks had rolled out and the stalls had been cleared, the girl and the bobcat still sat together under the soft orange sky. Someone had placed a wool blanket over the girl's shoulders, but she hadn't noticed. The bobcat's breathing was slow and steady. Her paw twitched occasionally in sleep, the way cats do when their dreams are safe. The decision had already been made. Quietly, unanimously, the bobcat would not be sent to a breeder. She would not return to confinement or conditioning. There would be no cage. Instead, she would stay with a local wildlife rescue ranch, the kind with wide fields, quiet care, and no steel bars. A place where she could be monitored, protected, but not broken. And the girl would visit, often as she liked. The rescue owner had nodded when the mother asked if that would be allowed. "She's not just a visitor," he'd said. "She's the reason this cat still trusts anything with a heartbeat." And so it was. The girl named her Willow, not because of her strength, though she had plenty, not because of her beauty, though that too was true, but because, she said, willow trees bend without breaking. The name stayed, and in the weeks that followed, Willow settled into her new life with quiet grace. She remained cautious. Yes, she watched strangers from a distance. But when the little girl came, red plaid shirt, mismatched socks, hair wild from wind, Willow came too. Every time, she would trot softly across the grass, tail low, shoulders relaxed, and settle beside the girl with a familiarity that no training could ever teach. Sometimes they would sit for hours, saying nothing, just being. And the people who came to the rescue, the volunteers, the caretakers, they all learned something by watching. That trust isn't something you can force. That wild things can love too. That sometimes what the world labels untamable is really just misunderstood. And that once in a while, someone comes along who sees past the claws, the growls, the fear, and finds what no one else dared to look for. Kindness, connection, home. One afternoon, several months later, a visitor to the rescue watched the girl sit beside Willow, the bobcat's head resting once again in her lap. The visitor turned to a staff member and asked, "How did this happen?" The staff member just smiled. "You had to be there," she said. As the sun dipped behind the hills and shadows stretched across the field, the bobcat lifted her head just once, blinking slowly as if to take in the view. Then she turned her gaze upward to the little girl, and for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the whole world had quieted to watch them. A child who never saw a threat, and a wild soul who had waited her whole life to be seen. Together, still and unbreakable,